I never expected the worst day of my career to start like this. It wasn't the first time I'd faced rude patients or had to put up with disrespect. But that day, something felt different. I work as a nurse at a private clinic in a wealthy part of town. Most of the patients are the kind who expect the world to bend to their will, and honestly, I've learned to deal with it. I'm used to the entitlement, the way some people look down on those of us working in service positions. But nothing had prepared me for the moment Mrs. Thompson came in. She was the wife of a millionaire tech mogul, a woman who made her wealth known every chance she got, from the diamond rings on her fingers to the designer clothes she wore. She always carried herself like she was above everyone else, but I thought that's just the way rich people are, so I ignored it. But today, things were different. She'd been to our clinic a few times before, always well-mannered. But on this visit, she had a different energy about her. She seemed agitated, like something was eating away at her. I figured it was stress from a recent event, so I didn't think much of it. When Mrs. Thompson walked in, I greeted her with a smile, introduced myself, and told her I'd be taking care of her today. Everything seemed fine at first. She settled into the chair, and I started taking her vitals, checking her blood pressure. She didn't say much, just stared at me with a look that I couldn't quite place. Then, out of nowhere, she snapped, "Can you hurry it up? I don't have all day, you know. You people are always so slow." I was caught off guard. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll try to be faster." She gave me a disgusted look. I swear, every time I come here, I get the worst of the worst. Can't they find someone competent for once? I didn't let it affect me. I'd been called worse, and I had learned to stay professional no matter what. But it kept going. Every little thing I did seemed to anger her more. When I adjusted the chair for her comfort, she scoffed. "Ugh, I can't believe I'm even here. The things I have to do to stay healthy in this world. And to think I'm stuck with a nurse like you from who knows where." I felt my face grow hot, but I held it in. I just nodded and apologized, trying to move the appointment along. But it wasn't enough. She went on, getting louder, the insults coming faster now. "Do you even know what you're doing? You're just here because someone needed to clean up after rich people like me. I'm not even sure why I bother with this place when all I get are lowlifes like you." At this point, it wasn't about me being a nurse anymore. It wasn't even about the fact that she was treating me like dirt. It was about her blatant racism, the way she saw me as beneath her because of my skin color. It was clear as day now. Her words cut deep, but I couldn't show it. I was there to do my job, not to engage in a battle over her ignorance. But then, things got worse. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward, and shouted, "I don't even know why you're touching me with your hands. You should be lucky I even let you close." Her words stung. I could feel my chest tightening. The other nurses in the room stared, too scared to intervene. I don't think they had ever seen her like this before. She was loud now, drawing attention from the other patients in the waiting area. But I didn't say anything. I didn't react. I just took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. Suddenly, Mrs. Thompson grabbed the counter and seemed to stagger for a moment. Her face twisted, and she reached out for me, her voice shaking. "I don't feel well." Before I could react, she collapsed, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Panic filled the air. I rushed to her side, checking her pulse and calling for help. My mind was racing. How could someone so full of hate, so full of anger, just fall like that? The room fell into a kind of chaotic silence. Everyone watched, but no one knew what to do. I did what I was trained to do. I checked her breathing and made sure she wasn't choking. I called for the paramedics. When they arrived, I stepped back, feeling the weight of the situation in my chest. I could hear the doctors whispering, saying something about her blood pressure being dangerously low. Apparently, she'd been under a lot of stress lately, but nothing had prepared anyone for the collapse. Her body had just had enough. After the paramedics took her away, the staff turned to me, offering quick reassurances. "It's not your fault," one of the nurses said. She was probably under a lot of stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was her own doing. Her hate, her racism, the way she treated me, it all felt like a sign of the bigger problems we never address. And now, she was getting the help she needed, while I was left to pick up the pieces of what had just happened. As I sat there, trying to get back to work, I couldn't stop thinking about how it all went down. I had been humiliated, treated like I wasn't even human. But in the end, it was her body that betrayed her. Was this some kind of karma? Was this the universe's way of balancing things out? I'm not sure, but one thing I know is that I'll never forget that moment. The way she looked at me like I was less than nothing, then collapsed a few minutes later. Maybe life really does have a way of putting things into perspective. And maybe, just maybe, the next time she looks down on someone, she'll remember what happened that day. The days that followed were strange. Mrs. Thompson didn't return to the clinic for a while. The gossip around the office was that she'd been in the hospital for a few days, recovering from what doctors called a stress-induced collapse. Apparently the stress had been building up for months, and her body finally decided it couldn't take it anymore. But no one ever talked about the real cause, the ugly, toxic attitude she'd harbored toward people like me. I tried to move on. I had to. I still had my patients to care for, and I couldn't let her words, her behavior, drag me down any further. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in me that day. It wasn't just the humiliation I'd felt in front of the other patients. It was the way I had been made to feel small, like I didn't matter simply because of the color of my skin. It's a feeling I've known all too well, growing up in a world where my worth is often measured by the wrong things. I've had to work harder than most just to be seen as equal, and I've dealt with more than my fair share of racial slurs, dismissive looks, and condescending tones. But Mrs. Thompson's words felt different. They weren't just an insult, they were a reflection of everything that society has conditioned people like her to believe. I wasn't surprised, though. Racism doesn't just appear out of nowhere, it's learned. It's passed down through generations. And in Mrs. Thompson's world, it was something that was ingrained in her every action, every word. A few weeks after the incident, I got a call at work. It was from Mrs. Thompson's husband, Mr. Thompson. He wanted to speak with me. I wasn't sure what to expect. I had no idea if this was going to be another insult or if he was genuinely concerned about his wife's health. I picked up the phone, and he introduced himself, his voice calm and polite. "I just wanted to thank you for taking care of my wife the other day," he said. "I know things got out of hand, and I'm sure it was a tough situation for you. But I wanted to let you know we're grateful for what you did." For a moment, I was stunned. Grateful? After everything that had happened? After what she had said to me? I almost didn't know how to respond. "Thank you for saying that," I finally managed, my voice quiet. "But I don't think I did anything extraordinary. I just did my job." Of course," he said quickly. "But I also want to apologize for the way my wife treated you. She's been under a lot of pressure lately, and we both know it was no excuse for how she spoke to you. It was unacceptable." There was a long pause, and I could feel the weight of his words. I didn't know what to think. I wasn't sure if he was being sincere or if this was just some attempt to smooth things over, but I appreciated that he acknowledged the way she had treated me. "I can't say I know what's been going on in her life, but I appreciate you reaching out," I said. "But it's not just her, it's something bigger than her. I don't think people realize how much these small, everyday insults can hurt." He was quiet for a moment before he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I understand, and I'm sorry. I've been thinking about it, and I know I haven't been the best husband. I've let things slide, and I'm realizing now that I need to do better." It wasn't the apology I expected, but it was one that gave me some relief. He didn't make excuses for his wife's behavior. Instead, he acknowledged the harm she had caused and admitted his own role in it. It didn't fix everything, but it felt like a step in the right direction. We talked a little more, and then we hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, still trying to process everything. The phone call had left me feeling unsettled, but also strangely relieved. Maybe this was the beginning of something for Mrs. Thompson. Maybe she would realize, one day, the damage her words had done not just to me, but to herself too. As for me, I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the hurt that had been caused. But I could move forward. I could choose to let it go, even if it still stung deep down. It wasn't about forgiveness or forgetting it was about healing. Mrs. Thompson didn't come back to the clinic for a while after that phone call, but eventually she did. And this time, when she saw me, she didn't look at me with contempt or disgust. She didn't sneer or make me feel small. She didn't say anything at all. But when our eyes met, I saw something different in her, a kind of quiet acknowledgement. Maybe she had realized, in the time she had spent recovering, that she had crossed a line. Maybe, It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me think that maybe, just maybe, people can change. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was a start. And that's all I needed. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Thompson's behavior remained noticeably subdued whenever she came into the clinic. There was still a distant air about her, a kind of pride she couldn't entirely suppress, but she no longer acted like I was invisible or beneath her. She'd make small talk with the other nurses, a polite nod when I entered the room, and, most importantly, no more cruel words. It was subtle, but it was enough to make me feel like something had shifted in her. Attitude seemed less rigid, less hostile, though I couldn't say if it was genuine or if she was just trying to avoid another embarrassing scene. Either way, I wasn't about to be the one to but even as things started to calm down, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. I wanted to believe that the change in her was real, that maybe she was genuinely reconsidering the way she viewed the people around. But a part of me was still bitter, still holding on to that memory of the way she had spoken. It wasn't until one afternoon, about a month after the incident, that I saw the full extent of the change in her. I was doing my rounds, checking in on the patients, when I passed by her room. She was sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the city skyline. For a moment, I thought I should just keep walking. But something made me maybe it was the vulnerability in the way she looked, the way she seemed so small sitting there, almost as if she had no strength left to I knocked lightly on the door and walked. "Mrs. Thompson, how are you feeling today?" I asked, trying to sound as neutral as possible, though the weight of the past still hung between. She turned, her eyes meeting mine, but instead of the disdain I'd seen before. "I'm okay," she said quietly, the words almost like a confession. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about everything." I stood there, unsure how to respond. This wasn't the Mrs. Thompson I'd known before. This woman sounded tired, like she'd come to terms with something, even if she wasn't quite ready to talk about. "I don't want to pretend like it's easy," she continued, her voice low. "I don't want to say the right things just to make myself feel better, but I've realized that I've been wrong. About you. About a lot of things." Her admission caught me off guard. It was unexpected, and it made the walls I'd built inside myself begin to crumble, piece by piece. "I know I hurt you," she went on, her eyes now avoiding mine, as if she couldn't bear to see the pain she'd caused. "And I hate myself for it. You didn't deserve. You never did." The vulnerability in her voice was raw. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do with it. I had spent so much time guarding myself against her, preparing for more cruelty. This was. "I know it doesn't fix anything," she said, her words trembling. "But I wanted to apologize. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how people like me are so quick to judge, to assume that we're better, when in reality, we're the ones who need to change." And I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to accept her apology, to tell her it was okay. But another part of me wasn't sure if I could. Could I just let go of the years of racism and prejudice that had built up inside? "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly, still unsure of where to go from here. "But I think it's going to take more than words to make things." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know, but I'm trying. I'm really The conversation didn't last long after that. We talked about her recovery, and I checked on her vitals. But the weight of her apology stayed with. I didn't know if she was truly capable of changing overnight, or if this was just an attempt to smooth things over. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like there was a chance for something. When she left the clinic for the last time a few weeks later, she gave me a small smile. It wasn't the same smug, condescending smile I had grown used to. It was one that seemed a little more human, a little more aware. I don't know if she's really changed. I don't know if her apology was genuine, or if it was just a moment of self-reflection brought on by her But for the first time, I felt like I could look at her without the bitterness I once held. I didn't feel like I had to protect myself anymore, not from. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something for both of us. Because healing isn't just about the apology, it's about the action that follows. It's about how we treat each other, every day, in the smallest moments. Thompson will ever fully change, but I know that I'm not going to hold on to the anger anymore. I'm not going to let her words define. And maybe that's the most important change of all. In the months that followed, things between Mrs. Thompson and me settled into a strange, cautious peace. She didn't come around often, but when she did, there was no more obvious hostility, no more cruel comments, and no more tension hanging in the air. But there was still an undercurrent, something unspoken between us, as if we were both testing the water. I saw her a few more times at the clinic, always in passing. She'd nod politely. The apology she'd given me, the one that had rattled me at the time, had stayed with me, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that it wasn't a cure. I had been hurt by her, and I wasn't sure how much of that I could just brush away. Then one day, a few months later, I ran into her again, but this time it was I was leaving the clinic after my shift when I noticed her waiting by the door, sitting in one of the chairs in the lobby, her head down as if lost in. I had a bad feeling about it. Was she going to lash out again? Was she just waiting to unload more of her bitterness? But as I approached her, I saw something that made me pause. Mrs. Thompson wasn't wearing her usual designer clothes. Her makeup was minimal, and she looked tired. Her posture wasn't the same. She wasn't sitting up straight like she used to, like she was always above it all. She looked human, for lack of a better word. I approached slowly, unsure whether I should say anything. But before I could turn away, she looked up and caught my gaze. "I know it's been a while," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. I felt my heart race for a moment, the old reflex kicking in, the wariness I had built up around. But this time, I took a deep breath and nodded. "What's on your mind, Mrs. Thompson?" Her eyes searched mine, like she was trying to gauge my reaction, before she spoke again. "I've been going to therapy. I know that doesn't fix everything, but I'm trying to work through. It's been a long process, but I know I can't keep going the way I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't sure what to say. There had been so much hurt, so many layers to untangle, and I wasn't sure if I could trust that she was really changed. But I saw the sincerity in her eyes, and for the first time, I didn't feel like she was just saying words to make herself feel. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But I wanted you to know that I'm not that person anymore. I've realized so much of what I've said, what I've done, was just me being scared. And I didn't know how to deal with that. It was raw. There was no defensiveness, no arrogance, just an honest admission of her flaws, of her struggle to face the things she had buried for so long. "I've hurt people," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "And I know it's not just you. I know I've hurt others. But I can only move forward, and I want to do better." I stood there, unsure of what to say. A part of me wanted to tell her that it was okay, that I forgave her, that I understood. But I also knew that forgiveness wasn't something I could just give out easily, not after everything she had put me through. I didn't owe her that, not yet. But I didn't want to turn my back on her. "I'm glad you're doing the work," I said finally, my voice steady. "I think that's a start. But it's going to take time. It's not going to be. And it's not just about saying the right thing. It's about showing up, every day, and proving that you've changed through your actions." She nodded, wiping her eyes. I know. I could see that she meant it, and for the first time, I believed. We didn't talk for long after that. She thanked me, and I said goodbye, but something had shifted between us. I didn't feel that knot in my stomach every time I saw her, and I didn't feel that immediate reflex to guard myself. I wasn't ready to embrace her as a friend or let go of everything that had happened, but there was a quiet understanding between us. Hey there. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit subscribe to join me for more powerful real-life stories that spark change and inspire strength. Together, we can explore stories of resilience, justice, and the moments that make a difference. Your support helps amplify voices that need to be heard, so let's grow this community of changemakers. I knew that change, true change, wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't a single apology or a few therapy sessions. It was a constant process, something that would take time and action. For Mrs. Thompson, it was a beginning. For me, it was a cautious hope. And in the end, that's all any of us really have the chance to try, the chance to change, and the hope that, with time, we can all move forward, together. The next few months unfolded quietly, almost uneventfully, as Mrs. Thompson continued her therapy, and I carried on with my work at the clinic. She stopped by occasionally, but our encounters were brief. I saw the small changes in her demeanor, the softer way she spoke, the way she no longer glared at me from across the room, but instead made eye contact, offering a nod of acknowledgement when our paths crossed. There were still moments of discomfort between us, moments when I felt that old tension lurking just beneath the surface. There were days when I caught myself waiting for her to slip up, to show that nothing had really changed, that she was just going through the motions, trying to be better without truly being better. But those moments became fewer and fewer as time passed. Then, one day, I received a message from her. It was a simple text, but it carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. "Can we talk? I want to tell you something." I didn't know what to expect. My first instinct was to ignore it. Perhaps it was another attempt to make amends, or maybe it was something else entirely. But there was something about the tone that made me pause. I'd seen her struggle with herself before, and now it seemed like she had something important to say. I agreed to meet her after work. We sat in a small cafe, the kind that had soft music playing in the background, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the air. It was casual, and at first, I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever it was she was going to say. After a few minutes of awkward silence, she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about my life," she began, her voice softer than usual. "About everything I've done. Not just to you, but to other people. The way I've treated others, the things I've said. I don't think I can ever take back those moments. But I've been trying to make things right." She paused, her eyes looking down at her coffee cup, avoiding my gaze. "I recently spoke with a few people I've hurt in the past, people I never really saw. I spent so much of my life in this bubble, thinking I was better than everyone else. But when I collapsed that day, when my body just gave out, I had no choice but to face myself. And it wasn't just my health that was in danger, it was my soul." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't just talking about surface-level apologies anymore. She was speaking about her inner transformation, the kind of deep, gut-wrenching change that doesn't happen overnight. "I've been reaching out to people I've wronged, people I've treated badly, and trying to make amends in any way I can. I know it doesn't fix everything, but I need to try," she continued, her voice steady now, but the emotion was still there. "You're the last person on my list." I blinked, a little stunned. The last person? After everything that had happened, after all the ways she had hurt me, I was the last person she needed to apologize to? "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Thompson," I said, my voice thick with the weight of everything we had been through. "I've already heard your apology and I appreciate it, but I'm not sure what else there is to say." She shook her head, a small but firm gesture. "I know, but I need you to understand that it's not just about saying sorry. It's about what I've learned through all this, what I've learned about myself. I can't go back and undo the harm I've caused, but I can change who I am from here on out. And I want you to see that." I took a long breath, trying to digest everything she was saying. It felt like too much to process all at once. She was asking me for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give, a chance to prove she had truly changed, not just for herself, but for everyone she had hurt. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Mrs. Thompson," I said, my voice quieter now. "I'm still carrying the weight of what you said to me, how you treated me. But I do see that you're trying, and I respect that." She nodded slowly, and for a moment, we just sat in silence, the weight of our conversation hanging between us. There were no more grand gestures or promises. This wasn't a movie, and there was no neat resolution. It was just two people trying to make sense of what had happened and where to go from here. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," she said, finally breaking the silence. "But I hope that, over time, you'll see that I'm not the same person I was before." "I'll try," I replied. "I'll try to believe that." As I left the cafe that day, I felt a strange sense of relief, though I couldn't entirely explain why. Maybe it was because Miss Thompson had finally stopped hiding behind her wealth and status, stopped pretending to be something she... Maybe it was because, for the first time, she was facing her own demons, acknowledging the damage she'd caused, and trying to make things... But I also knew that her journey wasn't mine. It wasn't up to me to determine if she would fully change. That was on her. What mattered was that she was taking responsibility, that she was learning, and that, in some small way, we were both finding our way. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was, and sometimes, that's all you need. A single step toward healing, a single step toward change. As the months passed, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't as angry anymore. It wasn't that the past had magically vanished, or that the hurt from those days had disappeared, but the grip it once had on me had loosened. I began to focus more on my own life, my own growth, and I found myself thinking less about Mrs. Thompson. That was a victory in itself. Mrs. Thompson continued her therapy, and from what I could tell, she was making real progress. We still had our occasional interactions at the clinic, but they were... Sometimes she would stop to chat for a minute, or we'd exchange a smile, but there was nothing forced about it. There was no longer that awkwardness, or it was as though we had both accepted that we couldn't undo what had happened, but we could choose how to move. One day, I received a small package at work. It was from Mrs. Thompson, and when I opened it, I found a simple card with a handwritten note in. It wasn't long, but the words she wrote stayed with. I know we're not friends, and I'm not asking for that. I just wanted to let you know that I'm grateful for your patience, your strength, and your grace. I hope you continue to find peace, and that one day you'll be able to forgive me. Thank you for showing me what it means to be truly kind, even when it's not. I sat there holding the card, feeling a mix of emotions. Her words weren't just a typical thank you or a platitude. They were a genuine acknowledgement of everything she had put me through and everything I had endured. And for the first time, I realized that the apology she had offered me wasn't about her needing my forgiveness. It was about her learning to forgive herself. Maybe that's what change really looks like, learning to live with the consequences of your actions, facing them head on, and then trying to make things better however you. A few weeks later, Mrs. Thompson came into the clinic. It was just another ordinary day at work, but as she stepped into the waiting room, I noticed something different about her. She was still the same person, but there was a weight to her presence that wasn't there before, something quieter, more. Hi there, she said with a soft smile as she approached the front desk. Hey, Mrs. Thompson, I replied, smiling back. How are you doing? I'm doing okay. Better, she said, her tone sincere. I just wanted to thank you for, well, everything. For the way you treated me when I didn't deserve it, for being patient with me. I know it wasn't easy. I nodded, feeling that familiar feeling of both gratitude and hesitation wash over me. I'm glad to see you doing better, I said, keeping it. But I have to be honest. I don't think it's about me anymore. She paused for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. I think you're right, she said, her voice quieter. I've spent my whole life thinking I could just buy my way out of things, just keep everyone at arm's length. But I've realized that the real work is in facing yourself, and that's something I'm still. There was something in her voice that made me believe her this time. She wasn't just saying the right things to make herself feel better. She was owning her past, and for the first time, I felt like she was ready to face the future without trying to hide behind her wealth or status. As she left the clinic that day, I didn't feel like I had to carry her apology around with me anymore. I didn't need to hold on to the bitterness, the anger, the resentment. I had done the hard work of letting go, and now it was up to her to continue her journey. But I was no longer part of that process. It had taken a long time to get here. It had taken everything from patience to heartbreak, and even a few moments of doubt. But somehow, we had both found a way to move forward. Miss Thompson had found her way, and I had found. I don't know where our paths will take us next. Maybe we'll never become close, and maybe that's okay. I'm learning that some relationships are meant to be brief, that some stories don't have happy endings but still leave a lasting impact. But what I do know is that healing isn't about forgiveness alone. It's about change, action, and the space to grow. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. The chance to heal, to learn, and to become better versions of ourselves, no matter how difficult or painful the road may be. Maybe that's the real lesson I took from all of this, that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for something better. As time went on, I found myself thinking less and less about Mrs. Thompson. She became a part of my past, a chapter in a story that had, at its core, been about growth, both hers and mine. And yet the story didn't end with us simply moving on. It became a foundation for the way I approached my life and my work. In my job as a nurse, I had always been there for others, comforting, caring, and sometimes bearing the weight of their emotions. But I hadn't realized until the events with Mrs. Thompson how much I needed to let go of my own weight, the lingering resentment, the hurt, the anger that had taken root in me. I had to heal too. I had to choose peace, not just for others, but for myself. It wasn't easy. Every time I interacted with someone who reminded me of Mrs. Thompson, every time I met someone who seemed entitled or dismissive of others, I was reminded of the tension, the anger that had built up within me over years of unfair treatment. But I didn't let it consume me anymore. I learned to put that feeling in perspective. I learned to move past it, to focus on the things that mattered. One day, several months after our last conversation, I received another message from Mrs. Thompson. It was a simple text, and at first, I didn't even want to open it. But something urged me to do so. Maybe because, after everything, I'd come to understand her, in some small way. It read, "I wanted to thank you again for being there when I needed to hear the truth. I've started volunteering at a local shelter for underserved families, and it's opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect. I feel like I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be. I'm still working on it, but I wanted to share this with you. You were right. Change takes action." I stared at the message for a long time, letting it sink in. This was the last thing I expected. I didn't know what to make of it. On the one hand, I wanted to be happy for her. She had made a choice to step outside her bubble, to do something meaningful for others, to put her privilege to good use. On the other hand, it felt like too little, too late. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that she had made a real effort, and not just for her own benefit, but for the benefit of others. That mattered. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what I could say that wouldn't feel hollow. But after a few days, I wrote back, "I'm glad to hear that. Keep doing the work. It's not about being perfect, but being better each day. Take care." And that was that. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was the closure I needed. I didn't need to be her savior, and I didn't need her to be mine. We had each learned our lessons, even if they were painful, and we had each taken steps to move forward. That was enough. I didn't see Mrs. Thompson again for a long while, but every now and then I'd think about her, wondering if she had truly changed or if her efforts would fade with time. In the end, though, it didn't matter. The only thing I could control was my own journey, my own growth, and so, life continued. I took on new patients at the clinic, became more involved in community outreach, and worked with a newfound sense of compassion not just for others, but for myself. It was easier now to see beyond people's flaws, to understand that everyone has a story, everyone is carrying. I didn't let one woman's past actions define how I saw the world, and that shift made all the difference. Sometimes, healing isn't about fixing someone else. It's about fixing yourself. It's about learning to let go, to stop holding on to grudges, to stop expecting others to change in the way you want. The real change comes when you stop needing their apology and start healing on your own terms. And so, as the years went on, I found peace not because Mrs. Thompson changed, but because I had. And in that quiet peace, I knew that I had let go of the anger, the bitterness, and the need for closure that once consumed. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely is. But it was a good one, and that was enough.